First, let me welcome our distinguished witnesses and thank them for their testimony today. As I've said, every hearing we've held, I'm committed to rail reauthorization this year. One area the next rail bill will likely need to address is the role innovative financing tools can play to advance intercity passenger rail projects. We all need to be creative in ways to stretch the federal dollars and work with our partners in the states, with communities, and the private sector. I've consistently advocated for the need to leverage private sector financing in my home state for the construction of high-speed rail. Without private sector engagement and financing, the California project is doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past and will require endless subsidies from federal taxpayers. Innovative finance has been increasingly used in the United States for highway and mass transit projects, and one of my goals for the upcoming reauthorization is to extend that trend to passenger rail. The Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing Loan Program is an example of a program I'd like to leverage even more. Currently, RIF is authorized to lend up to $35 billion in loans and loan guarantees for the development of railroad infrastructure. The program was created principally for short line and Class 1 freight railroads, though recently commuter and intercity passenger rail operators have expressed interest in the program. RIF and other federal credit programs can accelerate large infrastructure projects if stakeholders come together to identify repayment sources. For example, Denver is utilizing RIF and TIFIA to complete a major expansion of Denver Union Station, which will improve intercity rail, commuter rail, and bus connections. The loans are being repaid with a combination of local revenue sources. This is an excellent example of states that private sector and the federal government partnering to build more infrastructure in new and creative ways. We need to encourage more of this type of innovative thinking at the state and local level so entities like the Altamont Commuter Express, ACE in my area, can make the infrastructure upgrades they need for the future. Station development is another tool that can be leveraged to support expanded and improved passenger rail services. Rail stations are often located in desirable downtown locations and can become the focus around which significant residential, commercial, and retail development can occur. Value capture methods such as the tax increment financing can be a means to leverage that private sector development to spur transportation improvements. Finally, railroads themselves can proactively use their own property to create additional funding sources. For instance, railroad right-of-way can be used to place telecommunication and other non-transportation infrastructure. In 2012, Amtrak generated $94 million in real estate-related revenue, and I'd like to work to see them grow that number even further. Again, I thank the witnesses for being here today. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Nadler for 5 minutes to make any opening statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking Chairman Denham for holding today's hearing on the role of innovative finance in intercity passenger rail. Unfortunately, Congresswoman Brown has an unavoidable conflict this morning, but I will do my best to fill in for her today as ranking member. In 2009, Congress passed the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act, PRIA, which expires at the end of this fiscal year. As the committee prepares to reauthorize PRIA, it is important that we take time to explore the role that innovative finance can play in the development of intercity passenger rail. But we must also not lose sight of the bigger picture. Under PRIA, we authorized a total of $9.8 billion for Amtrak for fiscal years 2009 through 2013. However, actual annual appropriations for Amtrak over this period were significantly lower, only $7.3 billion, or $2.5 billion lower than the authorized amount. Funding for Amtrak pales in comparison to those investments we make as a nation in our highways and airports. Today, federal spending on highway construction exceeds $42 billion annually. We have not spent that kind of money on passenger rail service over the entire course of Amtrak's 43-year existence. Looking back, the figures are no different. From 1947 to 1970, when Amtrak was created, the federal government spent $11.3 billion in aviation and $52.4 billion on the development of the interstate highway system, and obviously nothing on Amtrak. There's no question we need to invest more in our railroads. A working group for the National Surface Transportation Policy and Revenue Study Commission reported that the total capital cost estimate of establishing a national intercity passenger rail network between now and 2050 is about $357 billion, or $8.1 billion annually. We are nowhere near that, and the House is currently moving in the wrong direction. The federal budget is being cut to unsustainable levels under the Budget Control Act and sequestration. The Transportation Appropriations Bill for FY14 that was just reported out of committee slashes Amtrak's capital program by $352 million, or 37% below the FY13 enacted level. And it slashes Amtrak operations by $119 million, 25% below the FY13 enacted level. Many of us will continue to fight these cuts, but given the current fiscal climate, I can understand why many would turn to the private sector. We should explore innovative financing options, but they should supplement federal investments in Amtrak. We should reject any illusion that private financing tools alone can fill the gap. They cannot replace them. We need to ensure that there is a strong federal role to help guide and support the railroad to grow and succeed. In fact, only with a strong federal role will we be able to properly leverage the private sector. Despite this lack of investment at the federal level, the demand for intercity passenger rail service is growing. Amtrak continues to set new ridership and revenue records each year, and it is doing all of this while facing budget cuts and uncertainty. We should build upon Amtrak's success and give Amtrak the tools it needs to truly implement a national strategic vision for intercity rail. There are several existing programs and options that could be part of the solution. The FRA's Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing RIF loans program is one tool that has the potential to help railroads, shippers, and states meet these rail infrastructure investment needs. Unfortunately, we are not taking full advantage of this program. We often hear that the application process is difficult, time-consuming, expensive, and cumbersome. There's been bipartisan support for reforming the RIF loan program, so I am hopeful that we will agree on improvements. As we draft the PREA reauthorization bill, it is the perfect time to look at the current RIF program and other financing tools that we can create or improve to see what we can do to help this nation's intercity passenger rail system succeed. Given the difficult economic climate, more and more states and localities are turning to federal credit programs and public-private partnerships. We have an opportunity, as we write a reauthorization bill, to find new creative ways to help incentivize continued investment in intercity passenger rail from both public and private partners. But again, these innovative private financing options must be incentivized. They should be utilized better. We should reform them, but they cannot replace budget cuts or lack of adequate federal investment. They are a supplement. They are not a replacement. Most of us here want to invest in and develop safe, efficient, convenient, and affordable transportation options like high-speed and intercity passenger rail. But if we want to see actual results and improvements in our nation's passenger rail system, we need a permanent solution. We need to show the public and the private sector that we support passenger rail and give our states, communities, and the private sector the confidence they need to plan and invest. To do that, we must increase the use of innovative financing, but we must substantially increase the federal investment of direct federal appropriations in intercity passenger rail. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing our panelists' thoughts and ideas this morning. I yield back.
Thank you. I now call on Chairman Schuster for any opening statement he may have.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and I appreciate you holding this hearing today. As I've said previously, I think we've got to figure out ways to make sure the investments are made in passenger rail, intercity passenger rail. And I think that it's not only money, but it's reforming how we go about it. Mr. Secretary, I'd like to welcome you here today. I should have started off with that. Thank you for being here. Again, we need passenger rail in this country. We've got to take a hard look at it and figure out where we're going in the future. The number I constantly remind myself of is that this nation is going to go from 300 million people to 400 million people. The projection in 2005 was it was going to take 32 years. We're already 7 years into it, 8 years into it. We're headed towards 400 million, and we're going to have to figure out how to get people between our major cities. You take the I-95 corridor, it's impossible to build another lane of highway there. So we've got to figure out how to improve moving people without moving them on the highways. I also believe that the partner out there is the private sector. There's countries around the world that have shown that private sector involvement can be successful, and it's a way to get those additional funds into investments made. Programs like the RIF program and TIFIA have shown us that we can leverage those scarce federal resources to make sure we're making those investments that we need to. And we also need to, and we're talking about reform, is leverage the railroad assets, like stations and right-of-ways, to make sure that we're developing and be able to capture that investment that's there. And again, we look around the world, there are places that have done that successfully. So again, I appreciate the chairman holding this hearing, and for the chairman's hard work traveling the country. I know he's been around talking to stakeholders and making sure they're heard. So again, Chairman Denham, appreciate all your hard work, and thanks for the hearing today.
Welcome, Mr. Borcari is our first witness today, our first panel. Then we'll go into a second panel. We will most likely have time for 2 rounds of questionings. We know that this is a very important topic, and we look forward to working with you on improving America's railroad. Amtrak, I agree with Mr. Nadler, has been improving, but we obviously have some safety concerns. We've got some infrastructure concerns. We've got some opportunities to really invest in continuing those improvements, and we look forward to working with that. I would ask consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record without objection, so ordered. Since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee would request that your oral testimony be limited to 5 minutes. Mr. Borcari, welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Schuster, Chairman Denham, Mr. Nadler, members of the committee, thanks for this opportunity. When President Obama took office, he laid out his vision for the 21st century American rail, a vision that aims to connect 80% of the nation's population to a high-performance rail network within the next 25 years. Since 2009, the U.S. Department of Transportation has made unprecedented investments in America's rail infrastructure to help make this vision a reality. And every step of the way, we've put people to work and generated economic growth in communities across America. Today, 6,000 corridor miles are being improved, 40 stations are being upgraded, 260 next-generation passenger rail cars and 105 locomotives are being procured. Our high-speed and intercity passenger rail program is investing more than $10 billion in strategic, market-based projects in 32 states. Our successful Tiger Grant program has awarded over $750 million to more than 45 rail projects, from station upgrades to large-scale freight initiatives. Our Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing Program, better known as RIF, continues to support major rail projects, and it's a great example of how our investments are able to attract private capital. One loan we issued through RIF allowed Amtrak to buy 70 new locomotives to modernize its fleet in the Northeast Corridor. These locomotives are being manufactured as we speak at a Siemens plant in California that employs about 750 people, with suppliers in 23 states building component parts. We've also issued 29 RIF loans to freight railroads, helping to upgrade our rail infrastructure and improve the movement of goods across America. Our innovative TIFIA program is another tool we're using to stretch our rail dollars further. TIFIA, that's the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, provides direct loans, loan guarantees, and standby letters of credit for major infrastructure projects throughout the nation. It's a powerful resource on its own, but when TIFIA is combined with RIF, the benefits are truly inspiring. For example, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, in Denver, at Union Station, Denver, both a RIF loan and a TIFIA loan are being used together to leverage more than half of the total project funding for the redevelopment of Denver Union Station. More than 2 million square feet of mixed-use space development is now being built around the station, spurred by the revitalization of the station itself. And it's estimated that public sector investments will create 7,000 jobs during the construction of that project. As you can see, in cities and towns across the country, rail investments lead to more jobs, increased private sector buy-in, and better infrastructure for everyone. It's a true win-win-win situation. To fully realize the potential for rail in America, we have to continue investing federal resources and leveraging them with our public and private sector partners. The President's 2014 budget request proposes a 5-year, $40 billion rail reauthorization. And we're proposing to fund this reauthorization by creating a new rail account as part of a broader transportation trust fund. providing much-needed funding predictability and consistency for both our public and private sector partners. Our current authorizations, passed in 2008 in true bipartisan fashion, were game-changing. Since they were passed, Amtrak's ridership, its on-time performance, and its revenues have reached all-time highs. The freight rail industry has invested in its infrastructure at a pace not seen since the 19th century, and last year was the safest in railroading history. Now imagine what we could do together if we treated rail like our highways and other forms of transportation and provided it with a sustained source of funding. Our highways and airports are already stretched to their limits and facing congestion that will only get worse with time. By 2050, we'll need to move up to, we'll have an additional up to 100 million people in America and 8 billion tons more freight per year. The demand for rail is at an all-time high. In the last 10 years, Amtrak's ridership has increased by 40%. This is the time to put rail funding on par with our other modes of transportation. Making large-scale investments on a year-to-year basis, we realize is both difficult and inefficient. No rail system in the world has ever been successfully planned and developed on that basis. Predictability in federal funding is a necessity. It's what states, local governments, and private sector investors are looking for. It's what will move America forward. And it's what will ultimately support the public-private rail partnerships that are needed to realize the President's vision for a national passenger rail network that's the envy of the world. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhardt. Let me first start by clarifying something that you said in your opening statement. I agree that there should be dedicated funding. I think if you're going to improve passenger rail across the nation, there needs to be that dedicated funding stream. So what are your ideas? Is it an infrastructure bank? Is it some type of new tax? What does that dedicated revenue stream look like?
There are a number of ways this can be done, and if you look at the ways in the past that Congress and the executive branch have worked together in a true bipartisan way to identify revenue sources, the entire spectrum of potential revenues would be out there. What is true, Mr. Chairman, is that any major infrastructure investments, whether it's our highway system or aviation, has required core public funding on a multi-year basis to be effective. So we look forward to working with you and members of the committee and Congress on identifying those revenue sources.
Thank you, and I'd agree. We need a 5 or 10-year plan to be able to plan any long-term project. But there is no plan that the administration has out there in print today that I haven't seen, is there?
The President's FY14 budget does identify pay-fors for the rail portion of the plan from the overseas contingency operations accounts, and we think of it as some nation building right here at home.
Okay. I think we've scored the downsizing of the war in many different funding scenarios, but we nevertheless, we look forward to working with you on that because we do agree that a long-term funding source like the Highway Trust Fund, only a Highway Trust Fund that actually is fully funded as well. We have some big infrastructure challenges that I think we can work on a bipartisan level. But let me start with a question about the RIF loan. In 2011, Department of Transportation approved Amtrak a $563 million RIF loan for the procurement of 70 electric locomotives. The loan will be repaid with revenue generated from Amtrak's Northeast Corridor services. In your view, are there further opportunities to leverage Amtrak's Northeast Corridor profits to accelerate the state of good repairs along the whole Northeast Corridor, both on safety as well as creating better efficiencies? I've done that train a few times now to see how many challenges there are and the number of projects that are in dire need of funding.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The short answer is yes. We believe there are further opportunities, whether it's through the RIF loan program, through, as you point out, station development opportunities and other value capture opportunities and baseline funding to restore some of the Northeast infrastructure. Despite the historic disinvestment in the Northeast Corridor, as you know, ridership growth has been steady and very impressive. The rolling stock in particular, these new locomotives will be very helpful, but I think it's worth noting that the Acela trains, the newest rolling stock in the Northeast Corridor, are now 20 years old.
And would it be helpful, as we're putting together the pre-reauthorization, would it be helpful to separate Amtrak's lines of business to make sure we're making loans to Amtrak that are not being paid for with a federal subsidy, so that we have directed fundings just on infrastructure improvements?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. We've been supportive of having transparency into Amtrak's lines of businesses to better support investment decisions, but also from a national perspective, especially when because it's important to serve rural areas throughout America on cross-country service as well, to understand what it will take to support that service in the long term.
And the RIF, the whole overall RIF program has not been fully utilized. There's obviously a great deal of money that's sitting out there that could be loaned out. And recently, the RIF loan program has garnered interest for advancing new intercity passenger rail projects. Does DOT believe that the RIF program can be used successfully to support passenger rail projects as well?
Yes, we do believe the RIF program has a part in both freight and passenger rail. There are some very interesting both applications and potential proposals out there. As you know, the RIF program is our one underutilized financial resource for both freight and passenger rail. We look forward to working with the committee and the users to find more effective ways to implement the RIF program.
And I know that there are high-speed rail opportunities to loan RIF dollars. What role, if any, do you think RIF can play in the California high-speed rail project, which, as you know, will require billions of dollars in grant funding that is unlikely to materialize without a dedicated source?
The RIF program is a potential source of a portion of the financing for the California program. That will have to stand on its own legs financially. And like every other RIF application, it would have to make financial sense in its own terms. But it is a potential tool, as are other state and federal revenue sources.
Thank you. We certainly agree on that. I think that they will have to prove their business plan to be worthy before they could apply for a loan, but we are certainly looking at other opportunities. Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to, before I get into my questions, I want to follow up on that. Do you believe that a high-speed rail system or any transportation system has to stand on its own in terms of turning a profit or at least breaking even, as opposed to being subsidized from the outside?
Mr. Nadler, we don't have any portion of the transportation system that stands totally on its own legs financially. What I was referring to is a specific RIF loan proposal, if we get one from the California High-Speed Rail Authority, would have to make financial sense.
But obviously. But we have to understand, I assume, that loan programs and any other innovative finance systems that I haven't heard talked about, I've heard PREA and RIF, are loan programs. They have to be paid back.
Right.
They have to be paid back out of revenues. And you're not going to build or maintain major systems out of their own revenues, even if you use part of that, especially if you use a larger and larger part of that for debt service. You have to have an outside subsidy from somewhere, correct?
That's correct. Mr. Nadler, we wouldn't have an interstate highway system, we wouldn't have the aviation system that's the envy of the world if we didn't have trust funds with dedicated revenue sources that year after year provided the baseline funding.
So we have to find
systems.
some revenue source for outside, in addition to creative use of PREA and RIF and anything else we can come up with in private PPP, we have to find some source, which we don't have now, of large-scale annualized public funding for passenger rail?
We do.
And there's no proposal on the table at the moment?
Apart from the President's proposal in the FY 2014 budget, we look forward to working with the committee in Congress on a multi-year proposal.
Thank you. The President proposed in the FY 2014 budget, and I think this may have been what you were just referring to, $300 million. Why is that necessary?
There's historic...
for state corridors. $300 million for state corridors.
We have historically, as a nation, underinvested in these corridors. There is great demand for great ridership demand that individual state corridors and regionally and nationally we have not been able to fulfill. The idea is to jumpstart the infrastructure investment process with some critically needed investments. Overall, the FY14 proposal has a number of different categories where it's proposing to fund both passenger and freight rail needs. And I mention those in the same sentence because with limited exceptions of true high-speed rail, we will have a mixed system in the United States.
And these are grants, not loans, correct?
Primarily, they would be grants.
Good. Thank you. Now, you mentioned that the administration proposes to fund Amtrak through actually, you were talking with the chairman, and you mentioned that the administration proposes to fund Amtrak through business lines rather than the traditional operating and capital debt service grants. Last week, the FRA, the Federal Railroad Administrator, testified that financing along business lines would not make sense with the low appropriations levels proposed by the Appropriations Committee in the House for Amtrak. Why is this so, and what do you believe would occur in the short term and long term with such low federal financing levels, and do you think the private sector would come in to take up the slack?
Basically, providing transparency along lines of business will highlight, as the administrator pointed out, the underfunding and the problem. It will show very specifically by line of business where more investment is needed. There is certainly a role for public-private partnerships, and we want to encourage those and maximize those to the extent possible. There is a large part of the system that is simply a public good that is not going to fit the profile of what the private sector would co-invest in. So the bottom line is a better, more consistent, and higher baseline level of public funding is needed, along with better and more public-private partnership.
All right, but the Federal Railroad, that makes sense. But the Federal Railroad Administrator testified that financing along business lines would not make sense with the low appropriations levels. Now, did he mean, or would you say that what doesn't make sense with the low appropriations levels, and that with those low appropriations levels that don't make sense, if you had financing along business lines that would make it more transparent and show more how much it doesn't make sense, or instituting such a system doesn't make sense with inadequate financing levels?
What the President's budget is proposing is transparency by lines of business and higher levels of funding. If you look at the current funding and the House proposal for funding, there would be some very difficult choices that the House would need to make on actually cutting back service.
But if you had very inadequate level of funding, would it still make sense to fund through business lines to make it more transparent, or is there some reason that wouldn't make sense if you were having senseless, inadequate levels of funding?
We have been promoting transparency across the transportation network, along with performance measures, as a way to show to restore public confidence and show the transportation investments on a business case basis make sense. So we would propose to do that.
Even if you had inadequate levels of financing?
That's right.
My time has expired. I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Schuster.
To follow along the line of questioning that the gentleman from New York, senseless underfunding, putting into a system that's not operating well or efficiently, the whole system's senseless. And so that's why I believe we got to start with reforming it, how we move forward, and then try to figure out how to get those funds. I think everybody agrees that there has to be some level of investment from federal, the state, from the government. As the Secretary said, none of our transportation modes goes along by themselves without some assistance. But again, going back to the investments that are made and not being properly invested, not being done in a way that we can maximize the return, I think is wrong. But I look at the Amtrak, and the ridership's gone up significantly. I use all the time the Keystone Corridor from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, which has gone up, I think, now about 70% in the last 5 years. Pennsylvania and Amtrak made that investment. And every time, and I ride it a lot. My district ends in Harrisburg, so I don't drive to Philadelphia because I think that's senseless sitting in traffic. But every time I get on there and I do the back of the envelope, and I did one right here to make the calculation. There's three prices basically, $19, $29, and $39. That might have gone up a little bit, but when you take that $29 or $39, which is what the typical business traveler is going to pay, $58 or $78 round trip. If you take the tax, the tolls, or excuse me, the gasoline you use, the parking you're going to have to take into consideration, and the tolls, it's $62 to $72. So, as I tell the governor, and the governor of the state of Pennsylvania is in control of the price in that line, the price needs to be higher. Nobody wants to pay more, but as a business traveler, as somebody that values my time, the calculation needs to be made, how much more productive can I be? Because I think that is a problem, and that goes to the point of the management of it is not like a private sector company would look at it, look at price elasticity, and they'd say, hey, we can get $100 or $110 round trip and increase our revenues. We're not doing that. My son traveled from Harrisburg to New York City, round trip. Good for me, it was $108. I couldn't believe it was $108. I probably would have paid $208 easily to make sure that he didn't have to take his car into New York City and deal with all the headaches and hassles. So that's the core to the problem, I think, is we've got to figure out how to reform Amtrak to manage it the way a private sector company does. And when we're talking about business lines, it makes a lot of sense to me. Now, as I said, above the or below the rail, that's where the investment's going to have to be coming from help from the federal government. But above the rail, by putting private sector practices or by bringing the private sector into the process, I think we can look at these different lines as standalone businesses. And that long, lengthy statement brings me to my question to you, Mr. Secretary. The President has talked a lot about it, but I don't think his actions have put the focus where they need to be. Dribs and drabs everywhere. I'm not a fan of the California high speeds, the investments being made there, because I don't think I can afford it. But do you agree we need to really focus on the corridors that make the most sense? For instance, the Northeast Corridor or a heavily traveled corridor, Chicago to St. Louis, those places like that. Do you think that we need to focus on those corridors and not try to spread our money so thin we're not going to have any kind of impact?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, much the same way that the interstate system was built, the passenger rail corridors are starting off as city pairs. You mentioned St. Louis, Chicago is a great example where that investment of federal public dollars is now resulted in 110-mile-an-hour service for a portion of it. Likewise, Detroit to Chicago, most of that will be 110-mile-an-hour service in the next few years. As the city pairs start connecting with each other, that you're building a network from the ground up. This is not a federal government master plan map of the country imposed from the top down. It's really demand, starting with city pairs and emerging corridors, building up. And again, I'd point out that that's the way, whether it's highway or aviation or any other part of the transportation system, that's the way most of our system has been built from the ground up.
Except when you look at the New Orleans to Los Angeles, the Sunset Limited, that's the biggest loser I believe we have. What are your thoughts on that?
Some of the cross-country service is very important for the rural areas that it serves. It is part of the conversation should be that those communities along the way and connected to a nationwide network through Amtrak. As we're losing intercity passenger bus service, for example, Amtrak is becoming more and more important for those rural areas that simply don't have transportation options otherwise.
Is that we are losing those intercity bus travel?
Yeah, well, the bus industry is changing rapidly, and a number of towns and areas that had been served with scheduled service don't have that anymore.
Right. And if the chairman will indulge me for another 20 seconds, just a statement. I agree with you. We need to figure out how to improve RIF loans, get them out there. $35 billion that's available, and we're not even close to that. We tried to, Chairman Micah and myself tried to, in MAP 21, try to reform that, but we were unable to. So I look forward to working with you in improving RIF.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Michaud.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here this morning. I want to follow up. You mentioned that there is some collaboration between freight and passenger rail, particularly in rural areas. It makes sense to do that. How many areas, number one, is that collaboration going on? And do you have any plans to increase that collaboration to include more passenger and freight rail? My second question is look at trying to hold down the cost. Have you, department, thought of utilizing the National Guard to use that as a training project so where they can use the man hours and equipment to actually build passenger rail to help hold down the cost? And my third question is, since the United States is negotiating with the EU for a trade deal, and if you look at the shipping lanes for that trade deal, it makes a lot of sense to actually have it shipped on the East Coast. And once it gets in the East Coast, I'll just use Maine for an example. Eastport's the deepest water port in the East Coast, doesn't have to be dredged. But how would you get that product from, say, Maine to California using rail? Have you looked at that as well?
Let me try to take those questions in turn. First, in terms of shared tracks, it's important to state that we have the best freight rail system in the world. It's the envy of the world. And one of the reasons that our economy is strong is because over the last 25 or 30 years, the freight rail system has come back very strongly. And in the vast majority of cases, where we have passenger rail service, it's on shared tracks, where it's serving both freight and passenger rail needs. That will continue to be true under almost any scenario. So we focus on the safety of the interaction between passenger and freight, but we're very mindful from an economic development point of view that we want to promote the freight side of it as much as passenger, and we try to make sure we have that balance there. As far as the National Guard, to my knowledge, we have not looked at that as an option. We have focused very much on the safety of the system, and that in part has been from the rigorous training requirements and safety management systems and other safety cultural issues that we've worked on together with the various railroads for a steady increase in safety. On the shipping lanes and the ports, it's a great point because what we have not been able to do much in the past is focus on the seams in the transportation system. We may have great ports that have a 50-foot channel and a 50-foot berth, but if we don't have great rail and highway access to that port, we haven't done anything. By category, one of the single biggest winners in our Tiger grants over the various rounds has actually been freight, rail, and ports. And it's because we've been able to take very specific, relatively small, targeted investments and eliminate bottlenecks. And there's great examples all over the country where, taking a systems approach, we've been able to eliminate some of those bottlenecks. Through the RIF program, through a continued Tiger program, and through base funding at an adequate level for a passenger rail system, we believe that we can actually keep working on those bottlenecks and build a system that serves both the freight and passenger rail needs, mindful also that there are other development opportunities and value capture opportunities for that right-of-way in the stations as well.
Thank you. I think it's very important that when you look at passenger, freight, and what's being negotiated, like with the EU, that you also look outside the box. My biggest concern, without getting the wrath of my friends from New York, is my understanding that they're going to have to spend about $1 billion raising a bridge. They're going to have to spend a ton of money dredging, which is costly. So here's, to me anyways, is a waste of taxpayers' dollars when there are other more economical ways, probably looking at ways that, how things go. And I'll be willing to talk to Ranking Member Nadler about that as well. But my next question is, and I heard Chairman Schuster mention it, about how businesses can afford more as far as cost. Have you done an analysis, maybe businesses can, but on your ridership, where is that return rate's going to be? So if you do raise a rate, are you going to be losing customers because they can no longer afford to afford the higher rate?
As a general principle, Amtrak, the commuter railroads, other operators are looking at that elasticity. They do it on different schedules and in different ways. On the Keystone service, I'm not certain of where that point is, but I think the Chairman's point is a good one. When the service started, the the point was to build ridership. Now that ridership has been built and the base ridership is there and it's still growing, there may be pricing opportunities. I'm not sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Williams.
Yes, Mr. Secretary, thanks for being here. Appreciate it. I'm a business guy. I'm from Texas, so I'm a big private sector guy. I believe in the private sector. My experience has been that big government and regulations and processes choke the heck out of opportunities for the private sector to get engaged. I guess my first part of my question would be, what do you propose? I mean, we haven't talked too much about regulations and how hard it is for the private sector to get involved with the federal government on private partner relationship. What do you propose to do about some of these regulations that seem to go on and on and on?
Yeah, first, sir, on the public and private investment, there's a great example I wanted to mention in Texas of Tower 55,
Right.
which is truly a national bottleneck.
Right in my backyard.
Absolutely, and a joint investment from the Class 1 railroads and the federal government is eliminating one of the worst bottlenecks in America. And I think that's a great illustration of the approach we're trying to take to eliminate regional and national bottlenecks through joint public-private investments. On the regulation side, we're working very closely with industry on the implementation of, for example, positive train control as mandated by Congress. We have made modifications to that program that we think make sense, and we have done that working closely with the industry. That's one example. I would say that there is a strong shared sense of safety and building a safety culture that, with or without regulations, cuts across the railroad industry, and it's one that we share with both our freight and passenger railroads.
Well, sometimes the process is pretty cumbersome, and there's ways, hopefully you'll find ways to make it easier to be a partner.
And I believe positive train control is an example of that, where the regulations that were mandated by Congress have actually been modified in response to legitimate points brought up by industry.
The other thing is, of course, we all talk about where the cash flow is, don't we? And public sector's got their cash flow, the government's got their cash flow. You know, it was mentioned earlier, where do you propose the government's money comes from? Are you talking about more taxes? Are you talking about tax increases? I heard you say earlier we're talking about also money that the President's planning on from the withdrawal from the wars. Seems everybody's got their hand in that. Where's the money going to come from? Are we going to tax? Are we going to have higher taxes, more taxes?
Well, first, the specific discussion about the fiscal year 2014 President's budget does have that pay for the Overseas Contingency Operations account. And again, we think of it as nation building right here at home and investments that will pay off for generations. We look forward to working with Congress on a larger discussion on a bipartisan basis of the levels of funding that will actually rebuild our infrastructure and turn over to the next generation what we inherited, which was a transportation system that drives the nation's economy and builds a better standard of living.
But you're not ready to commit for tax increases right now.
I'm not proposing anything.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. And with that, Ms. Napolitano, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad that we have an opportunity to go over some of the issues that are very important to my district and for California. Secretary Percari, there have been some potential and successful RIF applicants in the program. They've raised some questions to me and to some of my colleagues because of the length of time of the review, the inefficiencies in the process, the lack of staff authority, the lack of communications, and other processes. In 2012, $83,710,000 were loaned to the Alameda Corps Transportation Authority in ACTA in California. It took them 33 months to get that loan. When they applied, it was during the recession, and there were problems with being able to pay the the loan because the ridership was down, and apparently they were requesting some relief to be able to refinance their loan. Do you believe there have been problems with the program, and what are you doing to fix them? The statute gives DOT 90 days but it doesn't begin to count until the application is deemed complete. Thereby, it took 6 months for their application to be deemed complete, even though there were no additional information requests to the ACTA. Are we working on being able to expedite, cut the time frames? Do we have enough trained and experienced personnel to do it, and your staff? And what should be the time limitation between the submission of the application and then, of course, the deemed complete portion of it? Because one barrier for some applicants may be the cost also for the transaction. And if you'd explain also, if you can, in a short frame time, what those costs are, and how and why they may change during the approval and negotiation process.
Thank you, Ms. Napolitano. I'll try to unpack that series of questions. First, as you know, the Alameda County Transportation Authority refinancing was, as you point out, through a very difficult economic time. Every one of our RIF loans, as I mentioned, has to stand on its own legs financially. It's an incredibly important corridor for national trade, but it is one where the refinancing as first proposed did not make sense, and from my perspective, was not approvable because of some of the financial issues. It took some time to work through that, given the size and scope of the project, and again, the national importance of that corridor to domestic and international trade. We clearly understand that there are process improvements that make sense and that we can do. 33 months is not the norm, but that is a project that, as originally submitted, needed substantial work together to get to an approvable state. Now, there are specific steps within the RIF loan application process. I'll be happy to go through those, but maybe the most important one is the independent financial advisor who, on an independent basis, is evaluating the creditworthiness of that specific application. And that creditworthiness review often takes a number of back and forth rounds and modifications to the proposal before we can get to a point where it's approved. We have tried to be very good stewards of the public trust in only approving RIF loans that make sense. We have a lot more capacity to approve RIF loans. We do think that we can front load the process better than it has been done in the past, where we can get to a complete application faster. And I think that's really the key to having a better process.
Should there be a time limitation between the submission of the app and the deemed complete?
Well, before the application is deemed complete, I can think of several examples of RIF loans that simply didn't have enough information to act on. And if we were required to deem them complete before the applicant supplemented that information, those loans would have been denied. So I think that there is a balancing act there in how quickly we can get to deemed complete. It's in our interest to do that too.
Can you quickly address the barrier for some applicants for the cost issue?
Sure, especially for the smaller RIF applicants. I believe the smallest RIF loan we did was on the order of about $85,000. So the transaction costs are very important, but especially important in the smallest ones. There's an investigation fee, which is 0.5%. That's what pays for the independent financial advisor. There's the credit risk premium, which is required by the enabling legislation. We don't have appropriated funds for RIF, so the applicants have to pay that in the RIF program. And basically, the less creditworthy, the higher the premium. So that can be a substantial barrier.
Or is there any way to be able to help the smaller entities that, because this could be one of the problems for the small entities being able to be successful?
Well, we do recognize the RIF program was originally set up, as you know, to help the short line railroads. And It's an incredibly powerful economic development tool for a railroad siding, a little bit of rolling stock for smaller businesses in particular. We can focus on ways to minimize the transaction cost, but the things like the payment for the independent financial advisor, payment of the credit risk premium, really aren't negotiable. And then, of course, the interest rate itself doesn't vary widely, but it does float based on I believe, the Treasury bill.
Mr. Secretary, I'd love to have, and Mr. Chair, any information to this committee on how we can help reduce those costs for smaller entities.
Certainly. Thank you. Mr. Webster, the floor is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this meeting. And I had a question about something local to Florida. There is a innovative, groundbreaking private sector project underway called All Aboard Florida, and it will bring not only modern passenger travel from rail from Miami to my hometown of Orlando, but also be great for economic development and also just great employment opportunities as well. Are you aware of that project?
Yes, I am.
Do you, I think it's probably the only greenfield passenger rail project it'll be completed here in the next few years. Is there anything that you believe DOT could do in order to help that project along and move it forward quickly and also without unnecessary delays?
Well, it's one of the RIF loan applications that we are looking at right now. I would say it comes in with some natural advantages in the sense that, for the most part, it's existing right-of-way, so and has, for at least a portion of the line, the environmental clearances that are required. So those are big pluses. I know and you'll hear more about this, I suspect, on the second panel, but there are more. There are some right-of-way and other issues to be worked out, but overall, there is a real need. This is a great example of, for the most part, what would be continue to be a shared use corridor where both freight and passenger activity can coexist very well. I don't know of any showstoppers for the proposal, but I don't know enough of the details at this point to know that there might be some. But in general, we welcome the proposal. We know the need is great, and for a system that could serve in phases or all at once, Miami to Orlando would be a big boon to the state.
Just as a side note, I'm familiar with TIFIA. I'm not as familiar with RIF as I am with TIFIA, but people seem to like TIFIA. People don't like RIF. Is there a way to come up with a hybrid program that would be more modeled after the TIFIA program?
One of the reasons that people like TIFIA is because they're not paying the credit risk premium. In RIF, they are. And again,
but this is more also, there's just some objections to it's kind of cumbersome in the way it's set up.
I think it's the point is well taken, and we know that in terms of re-engineering the process, that we can make it both an appropriately scrutinized process that includes the independent financial review, but we can also make it a better process. And as I mentioned, front-loading, everything else being equal, doing more work together with the applicant up front, rather than having a consecutive process where you're asking them questions or sending them requests for information and then providing it.
And that's what I heard. There's like this back and forth that seems unending.
Yeah, we're not interested in turning this into the Consultants Full Employment Act. What we would like to do is make it both a responsive and responsible process.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and the gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Picard, for being here. I represent a small city of about 110,000 people in southern Minnesota. It also happens to be the world's premier medical destination, Rochester, Minnesota, and the Mayo Clinic. They have 2.75 million visitors a year, generating $10 billion of economic activity. They employ 40,000 people, which is more than Chrysler's entire workforce in the United States. They are fed by 2 highways that are at one point within 20 miles of the city, 2 lanes. They're on there. That's the situation. There has been a concerted effort of local, state, private partners to build intercity rail to obviously the destination of the Twin Cities and the airport where the bulk of those 2.75 million people fly into. My question as we go forward on this, and I'm one, I often hear it appears like when we talk about these things that some of my colleagues believe our best days are behind us. We have economic engines that are outpacing anything in the world. We have innovation that's out-innovating anybody else in the world. What's holding us back is an outdated, outmoded transportation system that is going to take creative thinking. My question to you is, and I hear it is, how does a city of 110,000 compete with a Miami, a Los Angeles, a Denver, the Eastern Corridor here? How do we make those investments there where I can guarantee you your return on the dollar is going to be higher than any place else you get? How do the programs, and I'm glad to see the budget sets aside money, but how do regional planning authorities compete with the metropolitan planning authorities? And how are you envisioning that to make sure that multimodal intercity rail transport is available to the people in southern Minnesota?
Excellent question, Mr. Walls. First of all, the clinic is a great example of an anchor institution that is a major employment node that our transportation system, whether you're talking about highway or rail or aviation for that matter, really hasn't kept up with. And transportation is economic development. At the end of the day, this country was built on tough investment decisions in transportation infrastructure that our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents made. And I think what you're pointing out is as new employment nodes emerge, we have an obligation to serve them as well. I am familiar with the discussion about passenger rail service to the facility. It's a great example of what may be an emerging node that would later be part of a larger regional and national connection. And I mentioned city pairs is one way that it works. Major employment nodes is another. We don't see this as a zero-sum game in the sense that with adequate baseline funding, there are emerging rail markets all over America that really can be served and can be served very well. And for families, for patients, for others that want transportation choices and don't want to have to drive, it would give them. So we see that as a great example of how an intercity passenger rail program that operates on various levels, regional, local, and true high speed.
How do we get away from the chicken and the egg scenario that our local private partners are waiting for the commitment and the investment, and then we keep hearing we need to see that local commitment going or whatever? How do we get started and break this logjam? Because this is, the chamber's all in. Labor's all in. I mean, people are all in on this thing, but we're caught in this dilemma that, well, how do we know the federal government's going to be there to do it? This is the case. If you can take your ideology and throw it out the window on this one, this is going to be a public-private partnership. Without the federal government and the state government, it won't happen. Without the private sector, it won't happen. How do we get there? What's the catalyst?
Well, we'll be happy to be the convening group for that. But as you point out, that is a very likely candidate for a public-private partnership where there are private investment opportunities, private redevelopment, value capture opportunities. It will take some substantial level of public investment, most likely at both the state and federal level, to make that happen. So if you think about three parties, private sector, state, and federal, it will likely take all three of those parties for that service.
Well, I look forward to working with you on this. I think it's an incredible opportunity to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Hanna is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. You said that you believe in RIF loans. You think it's a good process, for the most part, problematic in many ways. And you've identified ways that you think it should be changed. Things go concurrently, not consecutively. But yet in your 2014 budget, you've made no changes in the process. Perhaps that's not a relevant way to go about it, but specifically, what would you do differently than you're doing? Because there's no indication that there's any changes being made.
Some of the same principles and practices that we've applied to the President's dashboard process. If you're familiar with that, we've taken projects of national and regional significance and greatly reduced the time frame, in some cases from a 5-year environmental document to 14 months, for example. The principles are things like concurrency. You don't need to do everything consecutively. If you can chart it out and do the processes concurrently.
Right, but you've made no changes in the program, but you intend to make changes in the program, or you just think that it's something you can do with the process that you already have?
The program is a work in process, and I'd point out one other part that I don't think we have done the job we need to on with the RIF program, and that's reaching out to potential users of it. You know, we talk to the railroad industry, and we talk to railroad users. That's fine, but state and local economic development officials are actually the ones that could probably best use it, and it's been a little bit of an eye-opener to see that for the most part they don't even know about the program.
I want to ask about another point that Chairman Schuster brought up, and that is the elasticity of demand for the product that you provide through, for example, Amtrak. And you indicated you weren't aware of when they go back and check demand versus pricing and how that's all done. And I think there's wide agreement here that the public has a large role to play in financing these things that are generally a public good and couldn't survive without public money. Everybody gets that. But how, on the other hand, can you justify additional public money without constantly looking at the demand-supply equation that exists out there? And clearly, there is a demand and supply are mismatched here, since we know the ridership is increasing, and yet it would seem as though that we're not taking advantage of the elasticity of our demand, which allows the individual using the service to pay more, and I would argue a fairer share of the benefit.
Mr. Hanna, I'll be happy to get the committee specific information on how and how frequently and by what process Amtrak evaluates their fares. I can tell you, as a frequent Amtrak user, it seems to me that they are taking advantage of pricing opportunities wherever possible.
But yet you don't know when they do it or when the...
I don't offhand, but we'll be happy to get that information for you.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Series.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I ride the Northeast Corridor just about every week, and the other day we had a group of members ride the corridor, and they pointed out to us some of the areas that we could work on to make it faster. But one of the things that I thought of as we were speaking is we're going to be making hundreds of millions of dollars of investment to save 4 minutes or 5 minutes on some of these turns. It just seems to me that if it's very difficult to make a decision to spend that kind of money to save 4 or 5 minutes, yet, you know, we keep growing. I know involved with light rail and so forth in many areas for many years. People don't want an increase in trains going by in the tracks because people have moved in. Some of the old track, you can't activate the abandoned tracks. So I don't know what you're going to do by the year 2050 to move all these people, 100 million people, and the freight and everything else, because it just seems the communities are part of the problem. And obviously, in our areas being so congested, the investment to save 3 or 4 minutes is very high, because I can see some of the other members saying, why should they spend, you know, $300 million to save 4 minutes? And I understand it. And my friend from Maine, he wants to take away the bridge in New Jersey, which has 260,000 people work because of those ports that come through there, because of the ships. So I don't know how you're going to do this. And we're not making an investment. The president makes an, you know, he creates the Transportation Trust Fund, and it seems like it's a one-shot deal. There's no real long-term vision for this. So, you know, I don't want to be in your shoes in 2050.
A couple of things, if I may. One, time savings is important, and you generally shave off a couple of minutes at a time. It's not a quantum leap. But what you get with that is even more important, which is, first of all, reliability and on-time performance, which in turn drives more ridership. You also tend to get new capacity as part of that, too. So while the attention may be on the time savings, it's the reliability in terms of on-time performance and the capacity that's the big payoff. I'd also point out in your Northeast Corridor example that through the Northeast Corridor Commission, which is the state DOTs and other stakeholders, there is a long-term master plan process going on right now looking at that very issue of greatly increased capacity, how you get down to the specifics of providing that capacity, and it's a very collaborative effort of all the participating states. So while we have one eye on today and on-time performance and maintaining the system we have, we are also paying attention to the future, knowing that these major investment decisions sometimes take decades to do, and we need to tee those up and make sure that they're appropriately scrutinized.
Do you look at abandoned lines in terms of maybe it's easier to go through activate the abandoned lines of train or tracks?
Well, again, using the Northeast Corridor as an example, there are no abandoned lines that I'm aware of that would have adequate capacity, that don't have at-grade crossings, that wouldn't be going through established residential neighborhoods or some kind of fatal flaw. There are opportunities for both passenger and freight rail in abandoned crossings. Many of them that have been converted to trails, for example, can support both rails to trails and rail service. But for the kind of capacity you're talking about for mainline service, I'm not aware of any right-of-way that's magically out there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here with us and the job that you do. Let me just ask you this. There seems to be pretty widespread agreement that the RIF loan process is too cumbersome, too bureaucratic, and I think I wasn't here for most of your testimony, but I think I heard you say that you agree that it needs to be improved, speeded up, whatever. I noticed that there are only 7 RIF loans that have been made since 2010, and how many applications are pending? Maybe you testified to that already.
I have not. It's a good question, Mr. Duncan. There are 8 applications pending, ranging from the high end of about $3 billion to about $4.5 million. So kind of running the spectrum of different projects. Beyond that, we know that there's interest in additional projects as well, ranging from very small ones like a potential port project to much larger ones. So while there's these 8 under review right now, there are other potential ones as well. We do agree that this is the one program where we have more financial capacity than applications, and it's a little bit frustrating for all of us that we know we could be out there building more infrastructure.
Let me ask you this. I noticed that of those 7 loans since 2010 that they totaled, I think it was a little over $800 million, and that 2/3 of it, $563 million, I think, went to Amtrak. And I'm told that the current Amtrak subsidy is this year is about $1.4 billion, and that's a little less than half of their total operation. Is that roughly accurate?
I would have to go back and check that.
And I also am told that Amtrak does get some subsidies, although much smaller, but some from various state governments. Would you happen to know how much they get from the various states?
The states for rail service provided in the states are paying Amtrak. There are standalone separate deals for those. One of the provisions of the PREA legislation was actually to rationalize those and have the states pay a proportionate share. Under that, some states will be paying more than they are now. Some states will remain relatively the same. But yes, there are multiple examples where states are paying for service, and that service would not be there without the state support.
Apparently, there's a private sector group, the Florida East Coast Railroad, that sees some real opportunities or possibilities for the route from Orlando to Miami. Many years ago, when Graham Claytor headed Amtrak, he told me that they had a study at that point that if they were able to add another route, that the next their most preferred route that they thought would be the most used would be from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, down through Washington, Baltimore, Roanoke, and on down through my hometown of Knoxville into Atlanta. Have there been any studies or any updates, or have you just in recent years as to what lines might show some potential if Amtrak could get some assistance from the various state governments and so forth?
Yes, one of the things that high-speed rail funding over the last few years has funded has actually been corridor studies and corridor environmental work. So extensions of existing corridors, for example, Richmond to Charlotte being one example, but other corridors as well. Using Atlanta as kind of a hub, there's a lot of interest and activity and some level of planning taking place on larger connecting corridors in and through Atlanta.
But before my time runs out, you said there was no segment of the transportation world that operates on its own, yet the difference between Amtrak and the story of freight rail is dramatically different. And freight rail, for instance, they've told us that they spent $25.5 billion just this year alone in privately updating their own infrastructure. What subsidies do you consider that freight rail is receiving at this time?
Well, first, freight rail has been a great success and a great example of private investment. And as I mentioned, I think that our private freight rail system is the envy of the world. Some of the public investments in it recently through Tiger Grants, for example, have been co-funding the National Gateway Project with CSX that goes through 5 or 6 states. I mentioned Tower 55 as an example in Texas, Colton Crossing in California. Those are just a couple of public investments where national bottlenecks would not have been eliminated without both private and public funding.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Esty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this very important hearing. Thank you, Deputy Secretary Porcari. I really appreciate your testimony. Before I get to my questions, I want to just flag for subcommittee members something that's happening in Connecticut where these issues are tremendously important. And the state of Connecticut has launched a website called Transform Connecticut, and it's accessible to all users. I've gone on it. We're getting wonderful suggestions from all sorts of members of the public, stakeholders, and it's an easy access portal and something we might want to look at more broadly in our, as we do this planning and innovation for improved passenger rail service. Last week, I had the opportunity to meet with Connecticut Metro North Commuter Council, which has been very active and doing surveys of users and giving us input, which I will certainly send along to you. We all know that there is crying need and demand for this service. The question is, how are we going to pay for it? And I support the concept of innovative financing, a fan of and co-sponsor of the Infrastructure Bank, but we need to figure out how to make this actually happen. In Connecticut, as we know, we had quite recently a derailment that shut down the entire system. And I'd like to point out, over the last 10 years, Connecticut has invested over $3.2 billion in this line because Connecticut owns this portion of the line, not Amtrak. But our Transportation Commissioner, Jim Redeker, who is also the current chair of the Northeast Corridor Commission, estimates an additional $4.5 billion is needed to improve just our state's portion of that line to bring it to a good state of repair. I want to thank you, Commissioner, Deputy Secretary, for announcing last fall the $120 million high-speed rail portion. But unfortunately, our chairman was stranded on that portion and saw how much that is in need of still being upgraded, as he was stranded about a month ago on that line. I have to tell you, however, that our state folks from DOT say they still do not have approval to spend those funds. It's my understanding that they're trying to coordinate and take 3 different grants and combine them into a single project. When can they anticipate receiving approval?
First, Governor Malloy and Commissioner Rediker have been great partners in this, and we appreciate the vision that Connecticut has as part of a larger system. We cannot simply take 3 grants and combine them. If you're familiar with grant procedures and the audit requirements, while projects can dovetail with each other, we need, from an accounting point of view, to separate the grants and keep them separate. We have been very scrupulous and careful in doing that. We do think Connecticut's probably a good example of a state where a higher level of interaction and perhaps some training and maybe even shared services or loan personnel would probably benefit that process.
Well, that leads to my next question. You know, our state folks are pointing out that the Northeast is the only region where FRA does not have a PMO overseeing these projects, and our state staff is worried about their capacity to do this oversight, and that, I think you just flagged that as part of the issue. Is that what sort of support might be available for states like mine for project management oversight to help us in this process?
Well, to be honest about it, the project management oversight capacity of the Federal Railroad Administration is strained right now. It is a program that we take very seriously. We have tried to work closely with Connecticut on the implementation of these grants, but given the financial pressures, including sequester on our FRA staff, we need to husband those resources pretty carefully. I don't want to make a promise that we may not be able to fulfill. What I will commit to is I will talk to Commissioner Rediker and explore ways that we can make this work faster. I know the will is there on both sides, and these are not always easy projects, but we need to get them done on time and on budget.
I appreciate that. Well, given the large amount of upfront capital that's needed for these rail infrastructure projects, can you project for us what a percentage of the financing that we should expect from the private sector if we're going to have a successful innovative project? What would that look like in your mind?
I can't give you a set percentage. It certainly varies from project to project. For example, projects that have good station development and redevelopment possibilities would typically have a much higher percentage of private investment. If there's other uses of the right-of-way along the route, that too would tend to drive more private investment. So that it's so project-specific that I really can't give you a percentage. But I will tell you, we're highly incentivized to maximize the private interest and investment in projects. First of all, it's a good sign that it's a healthy project, but beyond that, it helps us deliver a better project that serves the public better.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Porcari. That wraps up our first panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Mr. Mike, I think, has one final question.
Good try. Good try. So many questions, so little time. Welcome back, Mr. Secretary, and
thank you.
Enjoyed our working relationship. We've had some great successes. I would have actually spoken for you to be Secretary, but I thought it would have hurt your chances. Guess it didn't work out either way. Maybe I should have spoken against you. We'll have to reconsider, but we look forward to having the new Secretary and your leadership. First of all, the productivity of the RIF process. I heard Ms. Napolitano talk about 33 months. You said you had 8, let's see, you have 8 pending applications?
Yes.
How many people work there at RIF? 5, I've told, 5, 6?
It's
half a dozen?
Approximately that.
$750,000 a year expenditure, processing. And in 2012, they did 2 loans. In 2011, 3 loans. 2010, 2 loans. 2009, 3 loans. It doesn't sound like a very productive shop. And 8 pending?
In addition to the pending loans, I would point out that an important part of the workload is the previously approved RIF loans, where in some cases we've had to rework and refinance.
If this was the private sector, you'll be out of job in an hour. In fact, you ought to look at the private sector, maybe processing some of these. This is unbelievable. When she told me 33 months on that one, it's just not very productive. And then Mr. Duncan pointed out, what did you say at the beginning? You had 29 loans? 29 RIF loans you spoke to in your opening testimony?
Yeah, I believe.
In what period? Well, I've got back a decade, about 30. So it doesn't sound like, again, a very productive shop. It took 16 loans just to get to the amount of the one Amtrak loan, the $562 million. And I'm not sure if I would have loaned them any money. Was that for equipment?
It was for equipment, and I would point out that...
Did you check their past history of buying equipment?
We
when
do.
When they bought the Acela trains, that they misdesigned them? And they were tilt trains to go faster?
I'm very familiar with that.
They improperly designed them. I'm sure you corrected that, because if they went too fast, they would hit the other train, so they put metal wedges in, so we have trains that don't work. Is this, I hope, a better purchase?
Mr. Mike, I'm sure you'd be pleased to know that the operating profit on the Northeast Corridor made for actually a very solid RIF loan for the locomotives.
Just for the record, too, I want to put in the list of FRA administrators. It doesn't quite equal the number of RIF loans, but they're good for about two RIF loans per FRA administrator. A question was asked a witness at a previous panel for that. So, Mr. Chairman, I would like that made part of the record, and also the record of not processing loans and the inactivity of the RIF process.
Would the gentleman yield for question?
No, not right now, but if he gives me time at the end, I'll go into that. The other thing, too, we're talking about financing. When is the administration, when are we prepared to open up the Amtrak monopoly on passenger rail service and let the private sector compete in some of these routes? Are you ready?
We have not, to my knowledge, seen any specific proposals for that corridor.
Well, first of all, folks came in at the high-speed rail time. They wanted to do the Northeast Corridor. They were summarily rejected with their proposals, and I'll be glad to give you folks. The Northeast Corridor, this newer member here from Connecticut, it's an embarrassment. 68 miles an hour from New York to Boston. The chairman who just left, he didn't want any mud splattered on him today, he was stuck, he just told me, an hour and a half going up to Connecticut to visit John Larson. Here's one I got here. 261 passengers Sunday were delayed 14 hours. This is 14 hours trying to get from New York to Richmond. It took them almost a half a day to get there. I mean, this just the other day. I'm telling you, we have a Soviet-style train operation. The private sector will invest if they're given some incentive. That incentive is a return on their investment, and you're not prepared to do that. The long-distance services are a joke. Here's the long-distance services. These are the money losers. This is what Amtrak's involved in, right?
Are there
you run all of
routes that you'd propose to eliminate?
What?
Are there specific cross-country routes that you'd propose to eliminate?
First of all, I would get the private sector to compete for them, and I would look at redoing the schedules. They don't have to fly like planes every day. Airlines adjust their schedule. Amtrak can't. They bring in a conclave of chefs to cook up a more expensive menu to lose more money on their food service, which is mostly on the long-distance services, right? The top 3 all increased their losses in the last year, including In addition to that, auto train to Florida, which serves my district. But they're all big money losers. When the private sector comes in, they can make money. We've got, if you work with them, we give them some incentives, and they have an opportunity for return. But the Soviet-style thinking and operation of Amtrak prohibits us from moving forward into the 21st century. Now, some of the others went over. Can I get a minute of grace? Just one more question. We worked very carefully together, and he did a great job. I'll give him a compliment on bringing the biggest carrier of people in the United States is not airlines, certainly not passenger rail. It's private passenger bus service, Intercity mostly. They run about 750 million people a year. We got, after much work, and Secretary Percari did, the private carriers located at Union Station over here on the second floor, all co-located. So the Greyhound riders, the other people didn't have to meet in Chinatown or someplace else. They could have an intermodal connection to the facilities. They weren't second-class citizens. We need to get people to use public transport if it connects. I heard from folks from Birmingham that they're building an intermodal facility there. I'd like you to check and see if they have federal funds going into that, because they're excluding the private carriers. The private carriers are our biggest carrier. They make money, they pay taxes, and they move more people than any other mode. They're good citizens, and they shouldn't be denied access to a federal facility. Whether it's in Orlando, we've got an issue there, Birmingham, or any other city, right? Right? My question was right?
I missed the question, the lead up to the question then. I'll be happy to answer any specific question.
Well, I thought it was fairly simple. You have an intermodal facility, private carriers should have access.
I'll be happy to look at the Birmingham facility. I'm not
Shouldn't that be
familiar
a
with it.
federal policy?
Yeah. I don't know. I will be happy
You
to get
don't
back to
know. I mean, they're paying taxes, they're making money, they're providing the biggest connection of transportation for passengers in the United States, and you don't know whether we should let them in? A federal facility? A federal help?
What I'm saying is I'm
there's
not familiar with the
financing?
Birmingham facility, and I'd like to actually know the circumstances before I answer. I just don't know.
We would
Okay.
look forward to getting that information.
Thank you.
Mr. Nadler.
Thank you. I just have a follow-up to some of the comments by our distinguished former chairman. Number one, on the private sector taking over the long-range routes, isn't the fact that Amtrak has those routes because the private railroads all gave them up because they were losing money on them hand over fist?
Yes.
And that I am not aware of any company that thinks they could make money running those long-range routes. I mean, maybe on the Northeast Corridor, but certainly, you know, and some of these long-range routes where there's much smaller ridership. But the second thing I wanted to ask you is, we talked about on the Northeast Corridor, the average speed between Boston and New York is 68 miles an hour, which is a lot less than between New York and Washington. But isn't one of the reasons for that on a large portion of New York to Boston, the track is owned by Metro North, that is commuter railroad, and the Amtrak train has to chug along behind a slower commuter rail because of the ownership priorities?
That is true.
So aside from building a new line or maybe expropriating it somehow from the commuter railroad, is there anything we can do about that?
The one thing, the basic answer is no. What we can do is make infrastructure investments to maximize the capacity that's out there.
To have an additional line in effect. Thank you.
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Well, again, I think when we took over passenger rail service in '71, there was a need for it. We've also taken over freight, and they've done fairly well with the private sector. I think some of these routes do need to be opened if the administration was willing or Congress is willing to give some private opportunity for private sector competition. And you would have to look at the schedule of service. You don't, you don't want them just to cherry pick. We'd have to look at the subsidization, look at what it's costing us now. I think that would be a fair route. I'd be willing to work with the gentleman on something like that. The Northeast Corridor, and I never did get to this, has incredible potential. In the report that was handed out to the committee, did you see this, Jerry? They get back about $94 million. Well, that's overall in revenue from real estate. I'm told, I had some private sector folks look at this, and the value of your real estate, you should be getting about $1 billion a year return. $1 billion. That's what they're leaving on the table. That could finance a lot of improvements in the Northeast Corridor. That's one of the most incredibly valuable assets in the United States of America. I'd be willing to work with the gentleman to do.
That we ought to look at. I'd be interested to know where that revenue come from.
Simple little things, but utilization of the right-of-way.
Fine.
They get $24 million from utilization of the right-of-way. That's peanuts. If I had $1 trillion asset and I was getting $24 million return, I should be putting nut house.
Mr. Micah, we should certainly look at that on the Northeast Corridor and anywhere else where that may be doable. I was just expressing my doubt that on most of these long-range routes, you have that potential, or that any private company would make a go of it. Northeast Corridor is quite different, and there may be some other corridors.
Well, the Northeast Corridor, too, again, if the gentleman would yield, you could take an operation like the route in England that Branson picked up. It went from a $300 million a year federal UK subsidy to a $100 million profit, plus paying dividends to investors. The ridership went from 14 million to 28 million on that one north-south route. That's almost equal to the entire ridership of Amtrak last year, which was about 31 million. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Seeing all debate has ceased. Mr. Burkhardt, I just wanted to clarify one final point before we go to the second panel. It's true that Amtrak has above the rail on the Northeast Corridor profitability of around above $300 million. Right. Isn't it also true that over 95% of the Northeast Corridor or Amtrak-owned infrastructure, 95% is on the Northeast Corridor?
That's about right. Yeah.
So it is also possible then we could use that above the rail profit as a dedicated funding source for the Northeast Corridor.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it would cover a portion of the needs.
And as we look across the nation, other opportunities, we would be looking at intercity rail, we would be looking at passenger rail, and in some areas even high-speed rail, where you have significant profits that will guarantee a return for the investor to be able to pay back those loans.
Over the long term, there's a strong likelihood that other corridors will have the kind of ridership that would generate that operating profit. You would be building up that ridership over a substantial period of time.
Mr. Chairman.
In an area where you have, I'll use my area for example, where we have proven ridership, where we have above the rail profitability on ACE train, the Altamont corridor, if they were going to expand to have dedicated track, they could actually apply for a RIF loan utilizing that above the rail profit as security for.
That's right, and if the independent financial advisor believed it made business sense, that would be a good RIF loan.
Thank you. Well, we appreciate your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, just one thing on that. That's above the rail, but the record should reflect also, I believe, that most of the $1.4 billion does go to the Northeast Corridor. The $562 million RIF loan also went to the Northeast Corridor equipment. So there has to be some calculation of the math and what's below, in the rail in addition to what's above the rail. Thank you.
Thank you. We thank you for your testimony here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.